With all the confusion we've had today, it's wonderful for us to be able to be together and worship God as we are this evening. We are God's children, and we understand that there's certain things that we understand, things that we need to have as part of our lives, characteristics that are important to us. Now, as we're reading the letters that Paul writes, he always has something important that he wants to say. And sometimes it's maybe a little bit hard for us to pick out what he's actually talking about. But he is also very clear on many other occasions. There is part of the letter that Paul wrote to the Romans that we can look at, and a lot of the things that he is describing here, he's describing about himself. But they are not things that should be unique to Paul and Paul alone. These are characteristics that we should have in us as God's children. This is from Romans, the 1st chapter, and beginning in the 8th verse and going through the 17th verse. Now, the things that are described here in this particular passage this is not a sermon that I have developed myself. In fact, I went through, and as someone else was presenting the lesson, I made some notes. But it is a wonderful thought for us to be thinking about, so I'd like to share them with you this evening. Romans 1, beginning in the 8th verse. First, I thank my God through Jesus Christ for you all, because your faith is being proclaimed throughout the whole world. For God, whom I serve in my spirit in the preaching of the gospel of his Son, is my witness as to how unceasingly I make mention of you, always in my prayers making request, if perhaps now at last, by the will of God, I may succeed in coming to you. For I long to see you so that I may impart some spiritual gift to you, that you may be established. That is, that I may be encouraged together with you while among you, each of us by the other's faith, both yours and mine. I do not want you to be unaware, brethren, that often I have planned to come to you, and have been prevented so far, so that I may obtain some fruit among you also, even as among the rest of the Gentiles. I am under obligation both to the Greeks and to the barbarians, to the wise and the foolish. So, for my part, I am eager to preach the gospel to you also who are at Rome. For I am not ashamed of the gospel, for it is the power of God to salvation to everyone who believes, to the Jew first, and also to the Greek. For in it the righteousness of God is revealed from faith to faith, as it is written, but the righteous man shall live by faith. The person that presented this lesson noticed about 9 different characteristics that Paul is describing here, first of himself, but he also describes these as characteristics that we need to have in our lives every day as we strive to serve God. In verse 8, he starts out, first, I thank my God. Paul was a man that we see in so many of his letters, he writes thanking God for the individual that he's writing to, for the congregation that he's writing to, for brethren that he mentions in here, and he knows their work, that they are doing wonderful things, whether it be an individual or a congregation. Paul just has so much thanks that he gives to the Father. He gives thanks for everything. We don't often enough give thanks. Now, at this time of the year, we're in a period where we set aside a particular day, which we did this past week, to give thanks to God for the blessings that we have received as a nation. We also need to remember to give thanks to God for the blessings that each of us have received. Where would we be if God did not give us oxygen to breathe? Where would we be if there were no gravity holding us down to the surface of the earth? Where would we be if we didn't have sunlight? Or if our planet were not spaced or positioned exactly like it is, so that we have a comfortable, semi-comfortable sometimes, but an environment that is suitable for us to live in the first place. And then there's so many other blessings that he gives us. The spouses that we're blessed with. All of the wonderful things that we have. You know, the jobs that we have. Where would we be if we didn't have some form of employment to keep us being able to have the provisions that we need? So many things that we need to be thankful to God for. Paul was a thankful person, and he was always giving thanks to God for so many of the things that he knows of. And here he says that he is thankful for the Romans. And it is something that he is noting about the Romans, that their faith, their love for God is something that is being spread throughout the world. People everywhere are hearing about the congregation at Rome and the love that they have for God. And Paul is thankful for this. In verse 9, there are two characteristics that we want to point out. First off, for God whom I serve in my spirit in preaching the gospel of his Son. Paul is a serving person. Now, as we notice the things that he writes and the things that he does, we read about him in the book of Acts and the missionary journeys that he went on and all the things that he accomplished. All of these things in serving God and serving Christ. Do we give the same type of service to God? Or are we just kind of haphazardly serving him? We need to think about and remember that Paul is an example for us as a Christian, and we should be learning from him and the things that he did and making sure that we are attempting to serve God to a halfway measure anyhow. I mean, if we even gave half as much service as Paul gave, we'd be giving a lot more than we do right now. But he serves God in preaching the gospel. We may not all be in a position where we can preach, but we should all be watching for opportunities to teach others around us. And when we do have the opportunity, maybe they ask us a question or something that we don't have an answer to. We've got our brothers and sisters that we can come to and encourage them, or encourage the person we're studying with, to meet with our Christian brother and sister to help them grow and learn. So there are ways that we can serve. He also says, all right, now taking out that one phrase in there, you know how a lot of the English teachers tell us, well, to get to the core of the sentence, and you've got this phrase here, well, you can set this phrase aside for a minute, and you can look at what the message is about. He says, "For God is my witness as to how unceasingly I make mention of you, always in my prayers." Paul is a prayerful person. He knows that he can't do these things on his own. He's got to have help. The best source of help that is available to any of us is God. So Paul, whatever the situation is, knows the best thing that he could possibly do is take that problem and turn it to God, and God will provide a solution. He is always mentioning things in his prayers that need to be resolved. But he also mentions those in his prayers who are being wonderful servants, and he's thankful to God for them. And he says he always makes mention of the Romans in his prayers because they're a very special group to him. In verse 10, always making requests, if perhaps now at last, by the will of God, I may succeed in coming to you. You know, there's so many things that Paul wanted to do, but did not have the opportunity to do. Maybe for some reason or another, the opportunity did not present itself. Maybe for some reason or another, he was prevented from going to a particular place. And that seems to be the case here. He says that he wants to come to the Romans and be with them. But there are things that will prevent him. There's also things that will be in accordance with God's will, and things that are not in accordance with God's will. So here he's saying, if by the will of God I am permitted to do this, I'm going to be coming to Rome so that I can see you and meet with you. But he doesn't set his thoughts, his desires over God's will. He is submissive to God. He allows God to take control. But this does not change his love and his desire to see the Romans. In verse 11 he says, "For I long to see you so that I may impart some spiritual gift to you, that you may be established." Now there's different words that are translated for established here. Another word is that you may be strengthened, or you may be rooted, you may be encouraged. Paul knows that Rome is a hard place for Christians to live. There's problems there, there's persecutions there. But he knows that the Christians are there, they are strong, they are being faithful. As you said in verse 8, that their faith is being proclaimed throughout the world. But there's a difference between encouraging somebody just in the mail by sending a letter, or encouraging somebody by giving them a phone call, or, and actually going and spending time with them to encourage them and build them up and strengthen them. Paul's wanting to do that with the Romans. He is a big encourager. As we read in so many of his letters, the things that he writes to the recipients there, whether it be an individual or a congregation, he's writing to help them be stronger in their service to God. He is encouraging them to keep on keeping on. And in 12, he also says, that I may be encouraged together with you while among you, each of us by the other's faith, both yours and mine. Paul says, in a sense, I'm being a little bit selfish here. I want to be able to encourage you and strengthen you, but I get strength from you. I get encouragement from you. And that's what's wonderful for us whenever we come together for our service. We're able to be together to strengthen each other and encourage each other. And it does not necessarily require that we do it at a time that the front door's open. We can call each other and talk to each other. We can see each other as we're in the store and we're shopping. Take time to encourage each other. There's problems coming at us. We're faced with all kinds of things. Satan wants to get us. But we can encourage each other to remain strong and remain faithful. Paul is an encourager. Also, in verse 13, he says, I do not want you to be unaware, brethren, that I often have planned to come to you. Paul is a person that we might say he purposes to do certain things. Every day when he woke up, you can just see in the attitude that's presented through the letters that he writes and the things that he did that are recorded in Acts, that he intended to do something powerful for Christ that day. He was purposing to do something for Christ. Just as he often intended, he often purposed that he wanted to come to Rome. Now he also notes here that he has been prevented so far. That doesn't stop him from purposing. I often purposed to come. I often planned to come. If we don't have some kind of a plan, what are we going to do? Normally we just sit back and twiddle our thumbs like Dewey's just demonstrating back there. Dewey's got the idea of what Paul's describing. We all need to remember that twiddling our thumbs is not going to accomplish the Lord's work. We've got to plan, this is what I'm going to do today. And then do our best to carry it out. The last part of the 13th verse, he says, so that he may obtain some fruit among them, even as also among the rest of the Gentiles. He had been planning and carrying out his plan in other places that he has already been. But those accomplishments are not enough. He's got to keep on going. He's got to keep planning and carrying out his plan. Verse 14, I am under obligation both to the Greeks and to the barbarians, to the wise and the foolish. There's an obligation. Why do you think that he felt he had an obligation to someone to do something? Who was the obligation to? Was it to the individual that he was going to be teaching? To an extent, yeah. What about to Christ when Christ says to each of us, go into the world and preach the gospel to every creature? We are under obligation to fulfill Christ's instruction. Paul recognized those obligations are something that have to be carried out. You don't receive an obligation to go to work every day and do the things that your supervisor says to, and then you just, roll over in the morning and not even bother getting up. When you have an obligation, you meet the obligation. Paul felt an obligation to everyone that he had the opportunity to teach. And since he was not as readily accepted by the Jews, he felt that he had this obligation to the Greeks, the Greek-speaking world, to the barbarians, to the world of the part of the world that didn't speak Greek. Whoever it was, wherever it was, if he had the opportunity, he was going to teach them. There was that obligation. Verse 15, so for my part, I am eager to preach the gospel to you also who are at Rome. He had a readiness in him that motivated him, that drove him. And he did not go into the situations without preparing. So he was ready to do the things that God asked of him. In verses 16 and 17, for I am not ashamed of the gospel of Christ, for it is the power of God for salvation to everyone who believes, to the Jew first, and also to the Greek. For in it the righteousness of God is revealed from faith to faith, as it is written, but the righteous man shall live by faith. Paul was not ashamed of the gospel. Paul was not ashamed to teach. Paul was not ashamed to go to places, even though he knew there was danger there for him. It needed to be done, and he was going to do it. He was committed to serving God. He also knew the power behind what was being taught. Not ashamed of the gospel of Christ, for it is the power of God for salvation. But it has no power if the individual out there does not hear it. He was committed to making sure that each and every possible person he could get the opportunity to preach to knew about Jesus, knew about the gift of his sacrifice, knew about the opportunity of salvation. He was committed to making sure that these things are being carried out. These are some of the characteristics that we see in Paul's life, but are we seeing them in our own life? We need to look in a mirror and make sure that we have these characteristics within us, that we have a thankful nature, that we want to thank God for everything that he has given us. And then we're going to take those things he's given us because they're the tools that we need in serving him back. And we want to make sure that we are serving. We want to be praying to him and letting him know how much we appreciate the things that he has given us, and the things that we know that we can't handle on our own. We are thankful and prayerful as we turn those problems over to him, because he can handle them. But we are still submissive to all of his instructions. We're submissive to serving him as we should. And even as we are serving, we know that we have the opportunity to encourage our brothers and sisters. We're all part of the same family. We're all part of the same team. We are all serving God. But it's a hard job. And so we need to encourage each other. And we need to make sure that the plans that we are making are appropriate for serving Him. That we're purposing, we're planning to do what God wants us to do, because we are under an obligation. Think about what has been given us. The sacrifice of God's Son's blood to wash away my sins, wash away your sins. And because of that obligation, we're going to do whatever it takes to make sure that we are ready to respond at any time that we have a need to serve God. We're ready to do what is required of us. And the commitment that we have to carrying all this out is something that's going to drive us every day of our lives in serving God. This is a wonderful description of Paul. It should be a description of us as well. There's a lot of things in here that just don't seem to fit us the way that they should. And maybe we need to talk to God and ask Him for strength and help to be able to complete or perfect these characteristics in ourselves. This evening, if you look at yourself in a mirror and you can't see all of these characteristics to some measure, and you're not striving to improve those qualities within yourself, there is an opportunity available to take one of these characteristics, the characteristic of being prayerful, and praying to God, and we can pray together to God for the strength, for these other characteristics to serve Him as we truly should. If you realize this evening that you don't have all of these characteristics to the extent that you need them, and you need the prayers of your brothers and sisters to help you achieve the measure of growth that you are wanting, and you want to achieve that commitment to serving God as you should, the opportunity for you to ask for the prayers of your brothers and sisters to help you, and to ask God for His help, is available to you. If there's anything we can do, just let us know as together we stand and sing.